At my grandson's birthday banquet, my disappointing son unexpectedly brought home a little courtesan, a girl who sold herself to bury her father. He kept insisting that this little courtesan was a good girl of respectable origin. He even shouted that he wanted to divorce his current wife and marry her instead. In my fury, I took matters into my own hands and dealt with her directly. Then I arranged for my grandson to inherit the title. It was utterly laughable. For in truth, my daughter-in-law is actually my biological daughter. Back in the day when I gave birth, I bled profusely, making it impossible for me to have any more children in this lifetime. To ensure that the heir of the Marquis of Zenon's household would not fall into the hands of an outsider, I found an abandoned baby boy from the charity hall and raised him as my grandson. As for my biological daughter, Anle, I raised her as my disciple, preparing her to be the true successor. These two children grew up together like childhood sweethearts, and somewhere along the way, love blossomed between them. I remember when Ziyu knelt before me, begging me to let him marry Anle. At the time, I thought it was fate's divine arrangement, so I shielded them from the world's criticism and prepared the grandest of weddings for them. But now, only 7 years later, everything has changed. It was my little grandson's 5th birthday. Though we didn't throw a grand celebration, we still invited a host of relatives and friends for some lively company. Yet Ziyu, the father, not only failed to come early to entertain the guests, but also arrived late. And to make matters worse, he brought along that courtesan dressed in a plain white dress. Upon a closer look, that pale flower was still smiling. As soon as the two of them arrived, the entire garden full of guests fell silent. All kinds of eyes were darting toward them. The pale flower hid nervously behind Ziyu, stealing glances at us, anxious and uneasy. No one had spoken yet, but she was already on the verge of tears. Yu Lang! The little courtesan tugged timidly at Ziyu's sleeve. Don't be afraid, Ziyu reassured her, gently holding her hand, whispering comfort to her. And Le frowned, glancing at me with a troubled expression. I shook my head slightly, signaling that I, too, was unaware of this situation. Well, now, whose young lady might this be? My sister-in-law deliberately drew out her words and cast a mocking glance at Anle. As soon as she spoke, I felt a pang of unease in my heart, a sense that this was about to go terribly wrong. Sure enough, Ziyu, as if opening a floodgate, hurriedly said, "Mother, I want to marry Liang'er." And Len nearly couldn't hold back, almost flipping the table, glaring at the pair of scoundrels. Unable to find words for a long moment, I was so furious, I almost laughed. Marry her? Your wife is sitting right here. Who else do you intend to marry? If today's events get out, the entire Marquis of Zenon's household will become a laughingstock. Ziyu's face turned bright red, but he stubbornly said, "Mother, I never loved the Yin family. We will never be happy together." And Le was almost faint from rage. Since marrying into the Marquis household, she had borne him children and managed the household affairs. Who would have thought I'd hear such insulting words now? Not love and Le, her eyes filled with tears. Ziyu, you were the one who begged me to marry you. I was young and foolish back then. All of it was your sweet-talking lies, she said, as Ziyu held his face in his hands. But now, after meeting Liang'er, I finally learned what true love is. He said without a hint of shame. I felt like I'd just heard the most ridiculous joke in the world. Ziyu, do you even realize your legitimate son is already 5 years old? My little grandson cowered in the nursemaid's arms, watching the scene before him in terror. Hearing us mention him, he timidly asked, "Father, aren't you going to uproot our family?" At last, Ziyu showed a flicker of conscience, averting his gaze, unable to meet his son's eyes. "Mother, though Enshai was raised by your side, she's just a girl with no father and no mother. How could someone like her be the legitimate wife of the Marquis of Zenon?" Ziyu asked in a self-righteous tone. "And how could her son be considered my rightful heir?" At those words, the whole table stirred in disbelief. Ziyu, are you throwing away every shred of decency? I stared him in the eye. And in my fury, a cold clarity washed over me. Mother, please let me and Leander be together, Ziyu pleaded, pulling the pale flower close, then knelt down with a heavy thud. His eyes were bloodshot, begging for approval. Let you be together, what about me? And Le looked at the man she had shared a bed with for years, utterly incredulous. You are nothing but a servant attending to my mother. If only you had stayed in your place. For my mother's sake, I can allow you to stay as a noble concubine. Ziyu's voice grew bolder. Jur may not become the legitimate heir, but he will still be the eldest of the concubine's sons. I will not treat him unfairly. The little courtesan raised her tear-filled eyes pitifully, gently saying, Sister, don't worry. I will treat Jur as if he were my own. What kind of thing are you? Do you think you have a right to speak here? And I spoke in unison, pausing as we glared at the pair of scoundrels, each more loathsome in our eyes. The pale flower pouted, then burst into tears out of fear. You Lang, mother, I know you favor and shy, but Leander is innocent. How could you take it out on her? Ziyu, unwilling to back down, pulled the little courtesan to her feet and roared at me. I am your biological son. And I weren't. I glared at him coldly, thinking how this son, raised by my own hand, was nothing but a foolish joke. And yet my sister-in-law chimed in with her sarcastic comments. I told you years ago. And she's status was too low. She was never fit to be the legitimate wife. See, sister-in-law, she said mockingly, this has all come true. If you had married into a noble family, if Inshai were the daughter of high status, how could such a disgraceful affair happen today? Someone else murmured in agreement. Auntie, I remember your daughter is also ready to be married, isn't she? And third brother, I hear your youngest son plans to take the imperial exam this year? I looked sharply at the two who were making snide remarks. What are you trying to stir up? My sister-in-law suddenly stiffened, her face tense, eyes locked on me nervously. Everyone here today is family, from the Z clan, she added hastily. I won't mince words. I pressed my hand against the table, slowly standing up, and calmly surveying the room. The pen cannot write to Z characters at once. If today's events get out, the only ones who will be looked down upon will be our Z family. I glanced coldly at everyone present, speaking icily. When our children marry or seek opportunities, people only consider the Z family name. And if you think you're here to watch a joke, we'll see if it's a joke they find worthy of watching. My sister-in-law froze in place, finally snapping back to reality after a moment, mumbling awkwardly. Nephew, what are you talking about? We're all family here. That's why we're saying these things. Once we leave this room, we won't say a word more. As murmurs of agreement filled the room, Ziyu's face darkened. Mother, I said I would marry her. Ziyu refused to back down, but I cut him off, then glanced at the pitiful little pale flower. What on earth is this thing? Thinking it can enter the gates of the Z family? The pale flower's face turned ghostly white, her body swaying, on the verge of fainting. Mother, stop targeting Leander, Ziyu protested, shielding the pale flower in his arms. Leander is innocent. Tears welled up in the pale flower's eyes. Madam favors my sister, and it's only right for her to be upset. Leander is willing to bear it for Yulang's sake. Yulang, please don't defy Madam for me anymore. Mother, look how considerate Leander is. How can you bear to be so harsh with her? As soon as Ziyu heard these words, he grew even more defiant. I couldn't help but find it amusing to see them defending such a worthless person. I've seen countless situations like this in your father's courtyard. So how could I not be hardened by it? Yet now, seated as the Marquis, you seem to have forgotten how your mother and I were once framed and humiliated by such little courtesans. You may feel compassion for her, but I find it ironic. I called out, someone, escort the Marquis to the ancestral hall. I didn't even look at him, simply giving orders to the servants. Ziyu, though obedient since childhood, knew the significance of being called to the ancestral hall for family punishment. I hadn't done this many times, but this time, I felt no hesitation. Even though the late Marquis died by my hand, every time I entered this place, a chill settled over me. So aside from ancestor rituals, I seldom came here. But this time was an exception. I had Ziyu strapped to the bench, with the family servants standing nearby, holding broadsticks. The little courtesan, overcome with worrying, threw herself onto Ziyu, crying and pleading. "Madam, Yu Lang is the Marquis. How can you treat him this way?" "Leaner, don't be afraid," Ziyu reassured her. "They wouldn't dare really hit me." After comforting the pale flower, he turned to the servant holding him down. "Are you trying to rebel? I am the rightful master of the Marquis of Zenon's household." The servants hesitated, but held him firmly, not daring to relax for even a moment. After all, the entire household answered to me, and none of them would dare act against me under my watch. The Marquis' estate was vast, with layers upon layers of courtyards, stretching so far that it seemed to form a dark cloud beneath the eaves, gradually closing in on me. I sighed, turning to face the pair of wretches. "So what if you're the Marquis? A Marquis, yet still an animal with no sense of propriety or shame." My words were sharp, leaving no room for politeness. The little courtesan's body trembled, her eyes widening in surprise as she looked at me. "Madam, how could you say such things about Yu Lang? Do you really intend to ruin his future?" Her voice, filled with sorrow, dripped like blood from every word. It was the pitiful wail of someone on the verge of death. Ziyu's expression shifted dramatically. In this dynasty, filial piety was of the utmost importance. If word of this spread, he would face endless scorn and humiliation. "Mother, how can your heart be so cruel?" Ziyu growled through gritted teeth, his eyes red with frustration. "You would abandon your own wife and child for the sake of an orphan girl? Am I wrong?" I snapped, locking my gaze onto him. "Let's not even discuss how Enlet entered this house and bore your children, managing your affairs, even if she had no great achievements. She has endured enough hardship for you. Even if she were guilty of some unspeakable crime, she is still your wife. If you were truly dissatisfied and wished to divorce her and remarry, you could have brought it up in private. There are more dignified ways to handle this." I continued. "But you chose to humiliate her at your legitimate son's birthday banquet. You spent your youth studying the words of sages. Which sage taught you to dishonor your own wife like this?" Ziyu was left speechless by my questioning. I waved my hand. "Come. Beat him until he understands his mistake." The family servants obeyed, striking with precision and steady hands. Ziyu's cries of pain echoed as he howled in agony. "Yu Lang is your own flesh and blood." The little courtesan wailed desperately, pleading for mercy. "How can you be so heartless?" Seeing her pitiful tears, I calmly replied, "There's no need to resist. I want to see how many blows this little flower can take for Ziyu." But before anything could happen, Ziyu shouted in desperation, "No!" The nursemaid loosened her grip just in time. The little courtesan's eyes rolled back as she fainted. How laughable she didn't even manage to block a single strike for him. "Mother," Enlet pleaded, her eyes red, "let's at least get the full story before we proceed." Her words always held weight in the household. And the servant paused, looking to me for confirmation. Sure enough, they stopped. Ziyu crawled over to the pale flower, cradling her in his arms, and glared furiously at me. "Don't pretend to show concern, as if I don't know what you've been up to behind the scenes." Ziyu shouted angrily, his voice trembling out of respect for my aging mother. "I've kept certain things from her, but now I can't hold back anymore." And Le looked at him with disappointment. "I've always acted righteously. What do I have to hide from mother?" Ziyu sneered, "You said it yourself." He turned to face me. "Mother, don't be fooled by her virtuous facade. And Shai is nothing but a poisonous woman. She's the one who forced Leaner as father and brother to their deaths." I frowned. "And Le, this child would never do something so ruthless without reason. Could someone else be manipulating the situation? The Marquis's household is vast, and we have many enemies. Could this be someone's deliberate plot? Sure enough, and Leia replied, "Before today, I didn't even know who they were. How could I have forced his father and brother to their deaths?" Still denying it, are you? Ziyu spat back angrily. Ziyu scoffed and asked, "Let me ask you, who is in charge of Hui Kuntong now?" And Le, not understanding his intent, nodded immediately. Yes, Hui Kuntong was part of my dowry. From the doctors working there to the apprentices running errands. All of them were handpicked by my family. It was thanks to Hui Kuntong that I was able to discreetly replace Yang Hai. After dealing with my husband and ensuring peace in the household, I handed over the shops from my dowry to him so he could manage them. First, to give him practice, and second, to give him something to rely on. Mother had long set the rule that Hui Kuntong would provide free treatment to poor families without charging any fees. Isn't that right? Ziyu pressed. Both Le and I looked at him differently now, and in unison we asked, "Since when did Hui Kuntong have such a rule?" And Le paused, then added, "Hui Kuntong is not a charity. How could it not charge fees for treatment?" Ziyu tensed. The manager at Hui Kuntong said there were free consultations on the 1st and 15th of each month. Hui Kuntong does offer free consultations. In winter, it provides medicine for colds, and in summer, cooling herbs. Who said it doesn't charge? You misunderstood. We do charge fees. And Le shook her head. For poor families, we don't charge consultation fees, that's true. But we still charge for medicine at cost price. If they truly can't afford it, they can write an IOU and pay it back gradually. I glanced at the little pale flower. My tone slow but pointed. If you want free treatment, go to the charity hall outside the city. Ziyu's expression shifted. The charity hall is filthy and stinking. How can anyone get proper treatment there? And Le rolled her eyes in response. And Le couldn't be bothered to argue with this pampered young master. When it comes down to seeking treatment at a charity hall, who cares whether they're sitting on a Huanghuali chair or the bare ground? She retorted sarcastically. Besides, though our dynasty's charity halls may be old, they're still decently clean. I took another long look at the little courtesan, suddenly feeling as though I'd seen her face somewhere before. Ziyu realized his slip of the tongue and quickly added, even if they're not exempt from fees, Hui Kuntong shouldn't refuse to treat a patient who comes to their door. Lianer's brother was gravely ill, yet the doctors at Hui Kuntong refused to help him, causing his death. Ziyu glared at Inshai, his confidence growing as he spoke. When their father came to seek justice, he was thrown out by the guards. Ziyu's outrage deepened. Don't tell me that wasn't by your order. As he spoke, and I started to remember the incident. After all, the Ministry of Justice had investigated, and Enle had once mentioned it to me as a joke. Hearing Ziyu bring it up now, Le began to shake with anger. Why don't you ask what his father and brother did? A month ago, a palace maid came to the Marquis's gates, screaming that her father and brother were driven to their deaths by our household. The steward threw her out, of course. At the time, I had just returned from Huguo Temple, and I saw that little white flower from a distance. Since it involved someone's life, I naturally had to investigate the matter. And what I found out was the second most absurd joke I've heard in my entire life. The little courtesan's brother originally worked at the docks, where an accident left him with a broken leg. He somehow heard that Hui Kuntong provided free treatment, so he went there demanding charity care. The doctors, seeing his pitiable state, decided to prescribe him some medicine. But unexpectedly, this man began to complain about the treatment, insisting that he needed expensive ingredients like ginseng and deer antler. And even then, he wanted to take these costly medicines for free. The shopkeeper refused, noting that the man's injury was only a broken leg, not life-threatening, and ordered his removal. The man, instead of accepting his fate, stood outside Hui Kuntang's door, wailing and shouting, claiming that the clinic's charity treatment was all for show. He also lamented that even in his pitiful condition, Hui Kentong refused to treat him. At a smaller, less established clinic, such complaints would likely force a quick compromise to avoid trouble. But with the Marquis's household backing Hui Kentong, and after years of experience, they had dealt with similar situations before and wouldn't be easily intimidated. The shopkeeper immediately reported the matter to the authorities. The little courtesan's brother panicked, and in his desperation, tried to hide inside a large water barrel. His injury wasn't originally fatal, but as luck would have it, the wound became severely infected. He didn't survive more than 2 weeks. The little courtesan's father brought his corpse to Hui Kentong, accusing the clinic of killing him, and demanded 500 taels of silver as compensation. Such slander, the shopkeeper handled with practiced ease. The shopkeeper exposed the lies of the little courtesan's father and brother on the spot, and ordered the father to be beaten and driven away. After returning home, the father, enraged, drank to gin of alcohol, and later that night, while getting up to relieve himself, he fell into the latrine and drowned. Their deaths were tragic, but they brought it upon themselves. A month ago, the little courtesan came to the gates of the Marquis's estate, claiming that the Marquis's household was responsible for the deaths of her father and brother, and demanded compensation, only to be thrown out by the steward. The steward, who had served me for many years, was cautious in his duties. First, he feared that if the rumors spread unchecked, it would tarnish the reputation of the Marquis's household. Second, he worried that there might actually have been some rogue staff in the shop, so he reported the matter to the Ministry of Justice, letting the authorities investigate thoroughly. As the saying goes, debts die with the debtor. And Le, upon learning of the deaths of the father and brother, chose not to pursue their wrongdoings further. She simply instructed someone to explain the situation clearly to the little courtesan. But within a mere month, the little courtesan managed to provoke Ziyu into standing up for her. And Lei explained the situation with just a few words, but Ziyu still wouldn't believe her. Whatever you say at the Marquis's household becomes the truth, doesn't it? Ziyu retorted. But how could someone so naive fight against a venomous woman like you? And Le looked at Ziyu, and in her anger, she laughed instead. Turning to me, she said, "Mother, I shouldn't have bothered at all." Her face showed both frustration and exhaustion. I signaled to the servants, "Continue the beating, blood relation or not." The men of the Marquis's household were all the same. Without a severe beating, they simply wouldn't listen to reason. This son is like that, and so was his father, who died early. After Ziyu was beaten until he lost consciousness, I finally ordered him to be sent back to the main courtyard. As for the little courtesan, who was only pretending to faint, I had her thrown into the woodshed, and Le, having held herself together for most of the day, finally followed me back to the inner courtyard, where she collapsed at my knees, sobbing. She cried for a long time, before choking out, "Mother, how did Ziyu become like this?" I held her close, gently patting her back, soothing her. "Don't worry, I've already sent someone to investigate," I said slowly. "When did Ziyu meet this courtesan? I want to know. When did his attitude begin to change? I want to know that too. And how many people? And how many things are beyond my control? I must find out. Mother, could this Ziyu be a fake?" And Les suddenly asked. "We grew up together. He wasn't like this before." I couldn't help but let out a bitter smile, stroking her hair as I replied calmly, "People change, especially men once they become someone's husband." I sneered, remembering my own husband who died young. And Lei raised herself from my knee, kneeling on the floor, her face no longer showing any of its former weakness. And Le was born an orphan. But thanks to Mother's care and guidance over the years, if Mother wishes for Enle to give up her position as the main wife, I would not dare to disobey. But, Enle bit her lip. "Jewel is innocent." I sighed deeply, bending down to lift her up. "Enle, remember this. No matter what happens, the position of Marchioness of Zinnan is yours alone, and no child but yours. is more qualified to inherit the Marquis's household. After all, you are my biological daughter. Wellesley Yu is nothing more than an orphan I picked up from the charity hall. Do you remember? When you first came to the Marquis's household, I wiped the tears from her face, staring into her eyes as I asked, and Le hesitated for a moment. It was when I was 6 years old. And do you remember the old Marquis? I continued, and Le shook her head, then nodded, trying to gauge my expression, and cautiously said, and Le had barely been in the household for half a year when father-in-law passed away. All I recall is that he treated mother with extraordinary kindness. I almost couldn't help but laugh. Kind indeed, we were childhood sweethearts, from families of equal standing. At just 10 years old, our families arranged our engagement. I smiled, patting and Le's hand. At the time, I thought I was the happiest woman in the world, and Le looked at me confused, unsure of where I was going with this. But then, one day he brought a stepson to the door, and in front of all our guests, announced that he wanted to break off our engagement. I said calmly, "Doesn't that scene feel all too familiar with today?" And Le's eyes widened in shock, her expression frozen in disbelief. What happened after that? She asked anxiously. Afterward, his father gave him a beating, forced him to marry me, and we completed the wedding ceremony. I sighed, of course, I never wanted this marriage. But both of my parents were already gone by then. My elder sister-in-law never liked me, and merely returning a portion of my dowry was the best she could do. There was no way she would allow me to break off the engagement, so we were forced into marriage. And those days I spent in the Marquis's household were truly difficult. I spoke calmly. My mother-in-law had passed away, and my sister-in-law was an arrogant and overbearing woman. Even the servants treated me with disrespect, favoring his concubines above all else. Mother and Le looked at me, troubled by the comparison. At least I have you to protect me. My days won't be as hard as yours were. Later, I got the old Marquis drunk, and that was the one time that led to my pregnancy. Ignoring her gaze, I continued recounting the past slowly. Over the years, I rarely spoke of those days. I had hoped to take these secrets to the grave with me. But here I am, telling you and Le. I know my daughter well. Though you have pride, you are also deeply emotional. Some things, if left unsaid, would make you endure silently until the day I die. After 10 months, I gave birth but to a daughter. I squeezed and Le's hand firmly, speaking each word clearly. And Le, you are my real child. And Le was struck as if by lightning, staring at me in shock, unable to speak for a long time. I had guarded against everything, but I never expected that before I gave birth, my husband would force me to drink a bowl of miscarriage-inducing medicine. I bit my lip, my voice raspy, so harsh it even hurt my own ears. It was that bowl of medicine. During childbirth, I hemorrhaged severely, nearly losing both my life and that of my child. In that fleeting moment of survival, I finally realized endless endurance would never allow me to survive in this vast and treacherous mansion. Though I managed to give birth to a child, I lost my ability to bear more children. To secure the heir position, I devised a plan and swapped the babies. It was all thanks to that wretched man. He tried to kill me, but after failing, he locked me in the courtyard, leaving me unattended for 3 days, only sending someone to collect my corpse. Had I given birth in a safe environment, it would have been much harder to swap the children. Later, I orchestrated accidents, rendering his concubines childless, and I ensured that wretched man could never have descendants again. I forced him to make Ziyu the heir. It sounds simple now, but in reality, it took me a full 5 years to accomplish. In those 5 years, my meddling mother-in-law, caught in an affair, was sent to a nunnery, and my father-in-law, devastated, fell ill and passed away within half a year. Men always said, 3 wives and 4 concubines are normal. My sister-in-law always telling me to be magnanimous, ended up married to a man who roamed the brothels. As for the troublemaking younger brothers, one committed murder and was sentenced to exile, while the other lost his right to take the imperial exam, leaving him dependent on the Marquis's household. And that son of his, who was supposed to take the imperial examination, he was ruined long before he had a chance. Mother, and then? And asked instinctively when I fell silent. Her curiosity piqued. Then I said, patting the top of her head gently. I spoke with deep meaning, since the heir has been established. What use is it to keep the old Marquis around? If the old Marquis doesn't die, how can Ziyu become the new Marquis? And how could I dare bring my daughter back to raise her by my side? And Le's eyes widened in shock, as if she couldn't believe her ears. And Le, Jur has already been officially designated as the heir, hasn't he? I asked, and Le shivered, stiffly replying yes. When Jur turned 1, the decree was issued. As soon as Ziyu dies, Jur will inherit the title. Let's see if Ziyu can come to his senses, I said, and we can live peacefully together. After all, even if he secretly keeps a few mistresses, it wouldn't matter. I held Le's hand to comfort her. After all, I've nurtured him for so long. I can't say I don't have a bit of attachment. To kill him off would be hard for me too. But if Ziyu insists on defying me, then he mustn't blame me for disregarding the bond between mother and son. No matter how much control I wield over the Marquis of Zenon's household, I can't change the fact that Ziyu is still the current Marquis. Unless he dies or becomes paralyzed, there's always a chance that this household could fall into his hands again. I refuse to let myself be pushed into that same pit of despair where I once lost everything. And I certainly won't let my daughter suffer the same fate. Just then, Ziyu woke up, howling that we shouldn't make things difficult for the little courtesan. So I simply ordered the courtesan to be sent to him, so he wouldn't disturb the peace of the entire courtyard with his antics. For days, the two of them have been inseparable, playing the part of devoted lovers. As my useless son would say, ever since Leander showed up, even the medicine tastes sweeter to him. I heard this news and snorted, then ordered the doctor to add several more doses of bitter huanglian into the medicine. I wanted to see just how sweet this medicine could taste. In a matter of days, the elders of the Z family took turns visiting, each humbling themselves, but speaking the same words. They wanted me to allow Ziyu to divorce his wife and marry another. They acknowledged that Enle was a good woman, but her status posed a problem. Why not take this opportunity, they suggested, to find Yushe a highborn noble woman? Looks and talent are secondary, but at the very least, her family would have influential connections in court. After all, the future of the Marquis's household rests on Yuji's shoulders. I found it amusing. What noble woman from a prestigious family would willingly marry a twice-divorced man with an heir from his first marriage? If the Marquis of Zenon were still at its peak, maybe. But my late husband was a reckless fool, and Ziyu is too mediocre. In just 2 generations, the household has become little more than a glittering facade. If not for Enla and I having some talent in business, this entire family would have long since been starving. I looked at them with a smile. Enle manages the household best. Every year, the Marquis's estate relies on him for 40% of its revenue from his various businesses. If he leaves, the household would immediately struggle to make ends meet, and there would be no money left to support extended relatives. As soon as I finished, the elder who had spoken earlier turned pale. But he's just an orphan. How could he possibly own so many businesses? Their words were filled with accusations, implying that I favored and let too much, and that I shouldn't have registered the businesses under his name. I held my tea calmly, with an indifferent expression. When he was 14, he said he wanted to earn his own dowry. I allowed him to leave the estate, and now these businesses are all ones he built up, one by one. All I did was provide the initial funds and personnel. I didn't do anything else. So that I could one day silence people like you, seeing their displeased faces. I added one more blow. By right, these businesses are his private property. So even if he doesn't contribute them to the family, it's perfectly justified. In our dynasty, there's no law forcing a wife to use her dowry to support the household. As expected, the lure of wealth changed their tune quickly. They shifted the conversation, now suggesting that you should take concubines. After all, men having 3 wives and for concubines is perfectly normal. My sister-in-law said, feigning concern, Yujie is truly fond of this girl. Why not just bring her into the household? Since the heir has already been established, a few concubines wouldn't make a difference. My younger brother-in-law nodded enthusiastically. If you don't like her, you could choose a few more concubines with respectable backgrounds. How about the 7th illegitimate daughter of the Minister of Revenue? She's a good match. I glanced at him, knowing full well that the minister's 7th daughter was actually his mistress. Feigning a sigh, I said, it's not that Enle is jealous and doesn't allow Yujie to take concubines. It's just that I trailed off deliberately. The elder frowned. What is it? Is there something wrong with the girl, that girl's father and brothers? That girl's father and brothers, I continued, had caused trouble at Hui Kantong several times before, even involving the authorities. I gestured to the door. I had people investigate and found out they were linked to Enli. My dear mother-in-law, even after all these years, still hasn't learned to behave. She did a fine job, though, using this little courtesan to successfully stir up rebellion in my foolish son's heart. The faces of everyone in the room instantly changed. They looked at one another, waiting for someone to speak. In the end, it was my younger brother-in-law who broke the silence. That old woman was unfaithful in her youth, and even now, she still can't stay out of trouble. Don't worry, sister-in-law. I'll take care of her for you. I saw the cold, ruthless gleam in his eyes, and couldn't help but smile. Then I'll leave it to you, third brother. But the elder brother-in-law spoke softly. Even if she's made mistakes, she's still your mother. I don't have a mother like that. My sister-in-law interrupted, gritting her teeth. If it weren't for her, she started to say, but stopped, covering her frustration by lifting her teacup to her lips. I knew what she wanted to say. If it weren't for our mother-in-law's scandal of infidelity, with her status, she could have become a consort to the crown prince. By now, she would at least hold some considerable title, instead of being married to a useless, hedonistic nobleman, constantly returning to her maternal family to beg for help. To support the concubines and illegitimate children in her household. Of course, my people had informed me of this, but I hadn't expected that the mother-in-law, driven to desperation, would be even more ruthless than I was. When Enle told me that Ziyu had run away with the little courtesan, I found it hard to believe. I knew my son well. He's never been able to endure hardship. So how far could he possibly run? I sent people to search for them for 3 or 4 days, only to see them again in the grand golden hall, wearing my official robes. The weight of the golden crown pressed heavily on my head, but the pain in my heart was far worse. Ziyu was standing there, his face twisted with rage, so much so that I almost didn't recognize him. To his left stood the frail little courtesan, and to his right, a skeletal old noon. My younger brother-in-law gritted his teeth, muttering to the old noon, "What exactly are you trying to do? Coming all the way to the imperial city to beat the grievance drum?" It turned out, this old noon was none other than my mother-in-law, the one who had been banished to the temple long ago, trembling all over. The old noon fell to her knees with a heavy thud, weeping bitterly before the emperor. This humble woman accuses the Dowager Marchioness, Madame Zigu, of framing her mother-in-law, poisoning her husband, and conspiring with Enshai to murder her own son. Ziyu also knelt, crying out again and again that I had forced him to marry Enle, with the intent to control the Marquis's bloodline. He glanced at me, biting his lip, then said, "In order to keep me obedient, Zigu has been secretly feeding me slow-acting poison since my childhood." The court erupted into murmurs of shock. A righteous censor angrily condemned me on the spot. How could such a venomous woman exist under heaven? Such a cruel woman must be executed by 1,000 cuts. I closed my eyes, feeling my blood run cold. It was as if my body no longer belonged to me. What a good son I had raised, indeed. To bang the grievance drum before the palace, and fabricate such accusations against me. He was determined to see me dead. You are not my son. I shook my head at Zu with fury, tears unknowingly streaming down my face. Zu knelt again, boldly requesting the imperial physician to take his pulse. To verify that he spoke the truth, he added, the servants and maids in our household can all testify that I was imprisoned by Zigu. I followed suit, bowing my head until my forehead struck the cold ground. The pain sharp and real. My father, who passed away, was a dutiful, reasonable man, and personally sought Enshi's hand in marriage for me. He continued, after our wedding, we lived in perfect harmony, full of love. I stared at the intricate patterns on the stone floor, my mind racing. It was during the heir's birthday banquet when this man suddenly arrived, declaring he wished to divorce his wife, demoting the legitimate son to a mere bastard. I, his mother, knew at that moment that this was not my son. I raised my head, straightening my back, and began to defend myself. My late husband, Zu's father, would never have allowed such a thing to happen. I sought to privately investigate the truth, but instead I am now being falsely accused. I bowed again and declared, this man is not my son. I beg your majesty to perform a blood test to confirm the truth. The imperial physician examined Zu's pulse, confirming that he had indeed been poisoned with a slow-acting toxin, which had likely been administered for at least 3 or 4 years. Upon hearing this, Zu's gaze toward me grew even colder. Even a tiger does not eat its own cubs. How cruel your heart must be. I held back my rising doubts, crying as I demanded, where have you hidden my real son? Zu glared at me with venom, and in a low voice, during the blood test, asked me, where is my true mother? Do you think this will absolve you of your crimes? No wonder you raised someone like Enshi. Both of you are equally ruthless. I glanced at him, too exhausted to argue further, as the blood dripped into the clear water. The result was unmistakable. They did not blend. Staring at the result in the bowl, I staggered back, falling ungracefully to the ground, pointing at Zu and crying out, you are not my Yushe after all. The blood test made everything clear. The emperor ordered that the 3 culprits be taken away. Zu panicked, reaching out desperately to grab me, but the imperial guards held him tightly. Mother, I know I was wrong. Please don't disown me. The little courtesan, now frightened, began to wail, Yu Ling is clearly your son. How can you be so heartless? Just to save yourself, you're willing to abandon your own child? I looked at her, unable to suppress the bitter laughter rising in my heart. Yes, I am a ruthless woman. But after all, he betrayed me first. The old Noon had lost everything. Yet she still refused to accept the truth, mumbling to herself, how is this possible? How can this be? Suddenly, her eyes flashed with a crazed light, and she shouted at the emperor, Your Majesty. It must be that she swapped the child to secure the Marquis's title. She's tampered with the bloodline of the Marquis's household. Before she could finish, the imperial guards gagged her and dragged her away. The emperor, tired of the commotion, sighed in frustration. Looking at the chaotic golden hall, he reassured me, Madam Z, rest assured, I will have this matter thoroughly investigated. I will make sure the Marquis of Zenon is found swiftly. I sobbed, kneeling in gratitude for the Emperor's grace, but inside I was filled with joy. The grievance drum outside the palace had only been struck 3 times since the founding of our dynasty, each time for cases that shook the entire court. But this time, it was for something as trivial as this. I could only imagine how vexed the emperor must be. The emperor probably had other important matters to attend to. But still, he had to deal with this farce. Your Majesty, I said meekly, on behalf of Zu and the downtrodden, I dare to thank you for bringing justice to the Marquis's household, even amidst external criticism. Well, dear mother-in-law, you tried to take my son away and disturb my peace, but now I'll ensure your son never rests in peace either. The officials handled the matter with impeccable efficiency, as expected, though the case had dragged on all day. Now, when people speak of the Marquis of Zinon's household, they do so with pity. When my brother-in-law came to visit, I was watching Jur recite his lessons. He gave me a broad smile. All thanks to your idea of the blood test, sister-in-law, or else our family would have been utterly disgraced. How so? I raised an eyebrow at him. My brother-in-law grumbled. That old hag had already bribed some lowlifes in advance, planning to spread rumors that you were unfaithful. I laughed heartily. If Zu's accusations had succeeded that day in the Golden Hall, then these sudden rumors would have completely destroyed me. But unfortunately for them, I never gave them the chance. You've been hanging around those shady places again, haven't you? I glanced at him disapprovingly. He rubbed his hands together, his face flushing with embarrassment. Well, sister-in-law, I've rounded up those lowlifes and sent them to the Ministry of Justice for questioning. A beating on the back will do him good. Big sister, I know you mean well. I shook my head, pulling out a silver note from my sleeve and handing it over. But it's best to visit those places less frequently. Otherwise, if your wife goes back to her family to complain again, I won't speak up for you next time. My brother-in-law gleefully accepted the silver note, grinning ear to ear as he said, "Oh, if only that shrew were half as virtuous as you, sister-in-law." He left happily, and as he ran off, he called back, "Don't worry, sister-in-law. I have many connections. I'll help you get more information about your son." I watched him go, feeling a mix of exasperation and resignation. The proverb "a sister-in-law is like a mother" echoed in my mind, but all it did was remind me that I had helped him time and again. Even as his life crumbled to pieces, his wife left him, his children scattered, and he ended up with nothing. Zu and the others were sentenced to death for their conspiracy against the reigning Marquis. Before the execution, I took and led to the prison to see him, bringing him a sandalwood incense stick as a parting gift. Mother, Zu, now in complete disarray, his body covered in horrific wounds, pleaded, "Tell them I'm your son. I really am your son. You believe me, don't you?" Watching his desperate expression, I couldn't help but find it laughable. How did I raise such a wretched creature? The slow poison in your system. I found it. I tossed the sandalwood at him. It wasn't lethal poison, just something to make it difficult for you to have children and shorten your life. I paused for a moment, then asked suddenly, "When did you start visiting in temple?" Zu sat there in stunned silence, staring at the sandalwood, unable to speak. I already knew it was for years ago. Oh, my dear mother-in-law. She spent for years setting a trap around you, turning you into the sharpest blade, just to one day deliver a fatal blow to me. What would a blade need children for? What would a blade need a long life for? After all, the future Marquis of Zinon she planned for was not you, but her youngest son, my brother-in-law. Do you remember what kind of life you lived as a child? I continued. It took me over 5 years to clean up this entire household. And during that time, even drinking a sip of water could mean poisoning. Many times, your dear grandmother tormented me on purpose, locking the two of us in the ancestral hall, leaving us without food or water for days. Surviving was a struggle, but she forgot. Zu clung to the bars, crying as he spoke to me. She told me you were the one who harmed father, that you framed her for infidelity, and made her suffer. She was my grandmother, he cried. And did your dear grandmother ever tell you how she ruined your father's life? I stared into his eyes and asked how my proud and upright husband, under her careful guidance, was led step by step from being a gentleman of promise to becoming a disgraceful, despicable fool. Zu looked at me confused. I smiled. Seeing you now, I finally understand. That wretched old woman destroyed my husband, and now she's destroyed my son too. Thankfully, she never got the chance to touch my grandson. As I left, Yu was crying and cursing behind me. But listening to his voice, I could only reflect. Being alive is a blessing. At least you can still curse. Giving them a proper burial is the greatest mercy I can offer. As for that little courtesan, she's none of my concern. The end.